Hi, this is Nancy Rolfsma with Quilting with Nancy. Thank you for joining me. This episode is all about the Winter Blues quilt. Now it might seem a little confusing because the quilt behind me is not the Winter Blues quilt that we have been working on. This is Paper Trees. I just did a little video on that and I'll put the link below just in case you want to know a little bit more about that. This is the 6th episode of Winter Blues. So if you haven't watched the first 1 through 5, I am including the playlist for all of that below. But if you have, it's time for you to put on your borders. Now, there isn't anything really tricky about putting on the borders. It really is very much like when you were putting the blocks together and the rows together. Okay, so you're not going to be learning anything new, but there are one little thing you got to do and then some options, all right? So the first thing that you need to do is take your existing quilt that you have finished and trim the edges of it to be a 1/2 inch larger than the points of the cornerstones. So if you're looking at that little picture with the ruler, right there where the 5, 6, and 7 is, that line I have put on the points of that cornerstone from the sashings, and I'm going to trim off that little bit at the top. So I will actually have a 1/2 inch seam allowance because we need that to put on our easy sashings just like we've been doing all along. Here is a picture of the options. The picture with the border that goes all the way across the top, that is really the easier of the options. And I think both of them look fine, but you need to decide. So the one with the border going all the way across, you will put the borders on the 2 sides first and then the top, and then your sashing actually is visible all the way going across the quilt. So you might think that looks odd, so your second option is to do like the other quilt is, where it looks like there is a cornerstone up in the top corners of the border. Totally up to you which way you want to do it. So after you have trimmed your quilt to that 1/2 inch, you need to then quilt your borders and cornerstones if you choose to do that. So there's a couple of different ways to do this. In the book, I tell you to cut the 5-inch border and cut a 7-inch backing and batting piece and then quilt it, because your backing and batting need to be bigger when you're doing the quilting. So then you can quilt them each border individually. Now what I did in reality is I just took a 20, maybe even 21, just in case it shrunk a little bit, strip of the border fabric. I put it on a bigger piece of batting and backing, and I free motion quilted all over that entire width of fabric that was the length that I needed. And then I cut them down to the border size I needed. Now, for me, I have a larger quilting machine, so it wasn't, a big deal for me to do that. But if you have a smaller sewing machine that you're doing your quilting on, whether or not you want to do free motion or a bunch of straight lines, it might actually be easier for you to do them as the individual borders. So just a couple of options for you to consider when you're doing this. All right. So now let me show you the quilt that we're going to work on today. Now this is a cute little puppy block. I did a whole quilt with this a couple of years ago. The pattern is actually from Color Works. I will include the link to this pattern. I called it Whimsical Applique. I'll include that below. So just in case you're curious how I made this super cute little scrappy puppy, there you'll be able to find it. So on this, I've already added 3 of the borders. So I did the sides first. So let's take this off. So I got my 2 sides done first. Then it was ready to put on my borders here. And on mine, I did do the cornerstones just because I wanted to. So for that, along with the piecing of your border, and I had just done some scrappy pieces in here, and then I took another square that was the same width as the border and did a square of that and added the little quilt easy sashings just like we did with the blocks. Nothing really new here. It's just seeing how it's kind of comes together. So now I will take my 2-inch strip. And I got to tell you, I did find it easier, especially on the large quilt, to put the 2-inch strip and the strip for the backing that is a 2-inch strip with the 1/2 inch folded up. I put them on the border just because at least that process was a little bit easier because this piece was smaller, especially with a big quilt. And the winter blues can be, there's 2 options, but the big one is pretty big. So then after you do that, then you press that out and then you would attach it just like you've done with all the blocks, doing the fusible interfacing to hold the seams together and your Roxanne's glue, and then doing the top stitch. And then you get to say, voila. Well, you do have to put a binding on it too. At least I would highly recommend you put a binding on it. But again, those are choices that are up to you. So I cut my bindings 2 1/4 inches, and I honestly, you can either do them straight a grain or on the bias. I like doing them on the bias. You know what? I have a video on that. So we will link that little video in the comments, in the description below too. So if you haven't seen the video on how to do, I think I called it like the precisely pieced bias binding or something like that. But it was all about getting those corners just right and using the bias cut binding. So then your winter blues is done. Now I would love it if you would send me pictures of your completed quilt. Or if you would like to do it yourself, if you could post them on Facebook. I know everybody doesn't do Facebook, so if you want to send it to me, I will post it with your name on it if that's okay, or just the image. And then, or you can post it yourself. You can go to the On Point TV Facebook page or the Quilting with Nancy show and share. I really like that one best because that's where other viewers post projects that they're working on, and that just is fun to see what everybody else is working on. I hope you enjoyed this series. Give us a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. I do have a membership available, so if you're interested in looking at what the membership is all about, there is a link to that below in the description section also. So a lot of things for you to read below. Be sure this time that you actually read all the information below. We put a lot of really good information in there anyhow, but this time there'll be all the links to the different quilts and things like that that I have showed you. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate every single view that I get and every single question that I get. So go ahead, leave me a comment or a question, and I'll talk to you soon.